Мимо трибун.
Russian troops mark World War II victory in Red Square as President Putin were fighting for their motherland.
Today you're defending what your fathers and grandfathers and great-greatfathers were fighting for, who saw
The son of Ferdinand Marcos be the next president of the Philippines. We'll have the latest from Manila. That's all coming up here on Impact. President Putin has sought to justify the invasion of Ukraine at a speech during the Victory Day parade in the Red Square in Moscow. He said the attack had been the right decision, alleging with no place in Russia today. Our correspondent Jenny Hill joins us now live from Moscow. And Jenny, I mean, no surprise, a defiant Vladimir Putin and parades right across the country today.
Yeah, that's correct. This is a really big fight against Hitler's Nazis. So it is a big day here. It's a somber day, but it's also a day of celebration. And it could have been a big day for Vladimir Putin. The general thinking is that he was rather looking forward to presenting a military victory in Ukraine.
Jenny, I mean, you know, despite all of these shows of force in Moscow, the bombs continue to fall on Ukraine, yet they
to publicly admit to, you know, any sense that his campaign hasn't gone according to plan. You know, a little after the parade, he actually met with the father of a dead fighter, and he told him that, you know, everything is going according to the plan, and he's pushing on with his plans in Ukraine, whatever they may be. He hasn't yet achieved the recently stated aim of taking the Donbass region. We'll have to wait and see. But listen, Yalda, I've talked long enough, I think, about what happened here in Red Square this morning. It's probably... Victory Day is one of the most cherished holidays in the Russian calendar. It's somber. 27 million Soviets died in the Second World War.
Including Crimea. Kyiv has announced a possible acquisition of nuclear weapons. NATO began active military development of the territories adjacent to ours. This was an absolutely unacceptable threat, systematically created for us, and
Russia's nuclear arsenal.
За победу! Ура!
But today was about rallying Russians too. Vladimir Putin has repeatedly tried to justify his war by telling them that Nazis... And there was a rare acknowledgement of the price paid. The Kremlin admits that 1,300 soldiers have died in Ukraine. The real number is thought to be much higher. But grieving families are told their sons and husbands have died heroes. Hill, BBC News, Moscow.
Now, those looking for clues to President Putin's intentions in Ukraine might be disappointed by his speech. There was no talk of mobilization, no declarations of victory, and no references to Kyiv.
Today, 9th of May, Victory Day in Russia, was not the speech that many here, indeed around the world, expected. There was much speculation. Would President Putin use this moment to declare an intensification of what he's always of Ukraine? To join our correspondent there, Joe Inwood. Joe, what was the kind of expectation of today's speech, this military parade in Moscow?
I think people, as to what was in the mind of that one man sitting in the Kremlin, whether people will be relieved, disappointed, it's quite hard to say, really. I think they would have viewed it, though, kind of very closely, knowing that what he said was going to have severe consequences for...
So I was looking at this speech also from that perspective, and it was one big nothing sandwich, or what's the right expression, just the same recycling of the same lies and the same post-Soviet babbling. The speech was as pathetic, as empty, as shallow as Russian army is, as the whole Russian state right now is just one big Potemkin village.
Well, you described the speech as pathetic, but what it does mean is that there's likely to be ever more war here on the ground. You're in Washington. Do you sense that Western powers, including the United States, are going to be with Ukraine for the long run?
We are still waiting, for instance, for this 33 billion aid package to be voted upon in the Congress in the United States. This is what we want, but in general, of course, the level of support and finally some courage that the West is showing is good for Ukraine.
Alexander Shurba, former Ukrainian ambassador, now in Washington. Onslaught in the east of Ukraine. Dnipro has been relatively quiet. The air raid sirens sound day in, day out. But after what have been weeks of relative quiet, it was shattered a few days ago when Russian cruise missiles. They're making plates for body armor in this furnace. He calls himself Talisman, celebrity blacksmith, artist, activist, and entertainer. Now his prehistoric technology. There's a big aid effort too. Dnipro is a first stop for families fleeing Russia's growing onslaught to the east. On this street alone, a queue for cash handouts and hygiene kits. Home to war, at a loss for words. Then this. Just when you're in a place where they're trying to forget the war, we've just heard that there's been a missile that's landed close by the area. 2 days before, Russia's cruise missiles slammed into this bridge and a railway facility, shattering weeks of quiet here. Several hours' drive from the main front lines. At moments, you might even forget.
Leave. We had to do it because of my daughter. I left my town to protect my daughter's life.
The train arrives from the east. Now the poorest and weakest pushed out by war, searching for Gennady. Hello, my dear, he tells him. We saw each other in Barvinkova last time. How could this happen? A grievous war many thought could never happen. Now no one knows when and how it can ever end. Concentration of Russian firepower and fighting forces on the ground.
Well, that was Lise Doucette, our chief international correspondent, who's in Dnipro for us. Now, stay with us here on Impact. Still to come. Early in
वही स्वाद नया अंदाज अमूल चीज ये मेरा चीज है
Nature, all-powerful and uncompromising, a force over which mankind has no control. But when one aligns with nature, she is warm, nurturing.
This is Impact on BBC World News. I'm Yalda Hakim. The Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, Mahinda Rajapaksa, has resigned amid a
which leads to Colombo's famous golf race green was absolutely packed with supporters of Mahinda Rajapaksa and protesters, anti-government protesters, and actually across the city there were scenes like that in the morning. Now the Prime Minister gave really tense scenes, and then further down the road from here, Yalda, at Golface Green, which is where for weeks now protesters have been peacefully demonstrating, some setting up tents and camping out there in protest at the government's handling of this ongoing financial crisis. Colombo is a capital city in a tense situation right now.
Yeah, very much so. And Regini, I mean, the Rajapaksa brothers have had a firm grip on the country for a very, very long time. So did it come as much of a surprise
Rajapaksa, who has stepped down as Prime Minister, actually was president before in another term in office. And it wasn't really a surprise that he was going to step down as Prime Minister today, because there'd been mutterings about this for the last week. And now he's finally gone.
And his daughter, Vice Presidential frontrunner Sara Duterte, cast their votes in their hometown, Davao City. Well, I'm joined now by our correspondent Howard Johnson, who's live for us from Manila. And Howard, just bring us up to date, because I am seeing some wires here now that saying domestic news outlets are saying that Bongbong is leading the presidential race.
That's correct, Yaldi. We're seeing actually at the moment that he is at this point, this unofficial tally that's double the lead on her at the moment. That's with more than half currently counted. So this isn't the official result, but it's an indication of where this is going. If this continues this way, it'll be a landslide for Bongbong Marcos, and that will mean that Philippine history will get infrastructure projects. The glorious and glamorous Imelda Marcos in her heyday, all of this stuff has been pumped out on social media, and it seems that the Philippine people are ready to give this family a second chance and to see what they can do with the economy now. Makati and saw that 3 of the machines had been broken. 1 was still not working by the time we got there. 2 had been repaired. And people in that room have been waiting for more than 4 hours. We have heard of a story of one person who'd waited 13 hours about the integrity of this election now.
Howard, thank you so much for bringing us up to date there from Manila. You can, of course, get in touch with me on Twitter. I'm at BBC Yalda Hakim. Business news coming up next, but I'll be back in 30 minutes' time.
Actually displaced a bit to the west of this system. What that means is the rain is running ahead of this system. It will tend to weaken before it makes landfall during Tuesday night. So the winds gusting to about 120 kilometres an hour will probably come down to about 80 or 90 kilometres an hour. Meanwhile, in Karachi, well, we are going to see temperatures rise here. But as I say, Pakistan could see highs up to 51 by Friday.
Nature, all-powerful and uncompromising. A force over which mankind has no control. But when one aligns with nature, she is warm, nurturing and loving. P-Mark mustard oil has always followed in nature's
Across Ukraine, people keep taking to underground shelters like this as Russian attacks intensify. There's still no end in sight to this destructive war. Join me, Lise Doucette, and our team.
This is BBC World News. An unofficial tally of votes in the Philippines suggests that Ferdinand Marcos' son may be heading for a landslide victory in the presidential election. Latest reports suggest he's winning double the votes of his main challenger, Leni Robredo. As violent protests continue.
And orderly fashion, they say, and without offering detail as to exactly when. The leaders of France, Canada, Germany, Italy, Japan, Britain and the United States announced on Sunday their commitment to the economic isolation of that the Russian oil ban is more of a slow burner than a short, sharp shock.
The reality is that the world relies very heavily on Russian oil. While there are excess reserves in a number of countries, such as Saudi Arabia, United Arab the world, the G7 at least, is trying to advance, a coordinated action where they try to squeeze the Russian economy and stop them using these resources that they're getting from their oil supplies into, further that is going on in Europe, where, countries that are more dependent, such as, as you mentioned, Hungary and Slovakia, in addition to Bulgaria and Germany, that would need a bit more time to try and divert those sources of supply from Russia to other.
It's begun in the United States, where our US business correspondent, Samira Hussein, is watching. What are you seeing at your end, Samira?
Well, look, markets just opened just a few moments ago, and we're seeing that the trend that we were seeing, before the start of the rest of the year. So I think that's really weighing on markets. And of course, inflation is really causing a lot of concern. And that, coupled with these rising interest rates and fears of another recession, I think there's just so...
It might start to reduce interest rates again. What's the latest you have on that?
Right. So I think right now most economists are pretty much in agreement that they think that the Federal Reserve acted too late, that they should have been raising interest rates, is to really tamp down on inflation, because inflation is really hurtful to the American economy. It impacts just how much people are willing to spend. And remember that 2/3 of the American economy depends on consumer spending. So
for joining us. Well, as we've been hearing, traditional investments are experiencing a bit of a confidence crisis. So too, though, the biggest name in cryptocurrency. Bitcoin has gone below $33,000 earlier today for the first time since overall market performance, have we? So do you think there's something changing here?
Yeah, something has changed, and it's really the big investors, the hedge funds, the fund managers. You may remember for years and years that Bitcoin supporters used to look forward to the day that the in 2020, they started pouring money in, and the price of Bitcoin absolutely rocketed. So did many other cryptos. It was a great time for Bitcoin investors and traders. But there was a catch. The problem was that a lot of the fund managers didn't know the economy started looking dodgy, inflation up, interest rates rising, and they were de-risking their portfolios. In other words, selling off lots of assets such as tech stocks that they saw as risky. They also started selling off Bitcoin and crypto as well. And you can see with the
investments. And I wonder if you've got the mainstream investing in it now, could those die-hard fans, start to see it differently? It becomes a bit normalized almost.
I think the diehard fans will always be diehard fans. At least that is the hope, not just for Bitcoin, but also for stocks as well, because investors would get, in my experience, so excited by the idea that interest rates are not going up, they're actually going down, that we could see a massive rally. Could be a short-term rally, but a big one.
Airline strike in Nigeria has been called off. It was the airlines themselves which planned to ground flights in a dispute with the government over the rising cost of aviation fuel. Now, it isn't clear what the government has offered or if ongoing negotiations will produce the subsidies which have been demanded. Don't forget, you can keep in touch with me and the rest of the BBC Business team on social media. I'm at Ty Enright. Until next time here on World Business Report, I'll see you later. Bye-bye.
Pressure from climate change, population growth and fractured supply chains.
But might these shocks to our system actually be a catalyst for positive change?
We have to wake up and we have to feed the world. That's a big job.
Can farmers...
Despite the immense damage it's suffering, its finance minister tells me what help is. Plus, we hear from a leading European development body about what the rest of the world can offer. Join me, Aaron Hazelhurst, on Talking Business Weekly here on BBC World News.
When the brutal slave trade was finally abolished, my ancestors got compensation. The slaves got nothing. Now there's a debate here about reparations. Join me, Laura Trevelyan, for Grenada, a journey to confront the past on BBC World News.
The latest news and results from around the globe. Sport Today.
Alcaraz climbs the rankings. The Spanish teenager has his sights on a Grand Slam after victory in Madrid. And James Harden inspires the 76ers the victory to level their playoff series with the Suns. And celebrities, a new track, a new energy, but the same problems though for Mercedes. Once again, it was Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc putting on a finale for the watching world. The current world champion coming out on top. Nick Parrott was watching.
Miami built a racetrack the last place. Championship leader Charles Leclerc was now in his sights, and by the start of the 9th lap, the Dutchman was flying into the lead. He was heading towards a comfortable victory until Pierre Gasly and Lando Norris got too close.
But I think we kept it exciting until the end.
It is going to be a long championship. It seems that they had the upper hand from 2 weekends now in race pace especially, and we need to take back the advantage as soon as possible.
With
Now up to 6th in the world rankings. Alcaraz took just over an hour to beat defending champion Alexander Zverev in straight sets. He's already beaten his idol Rafa Nadal and the world #1 Novak Djokovic to make the final. So could we be looking at one of the next big superstars of the game? Well, his win certainly
thing to happen in men's tennis in a long time, since the likes of Federer, Nadal and Djokovic and Murray crept onto the scene. And you can feel it. You can feel it in the atmosphere. You can feel it there in Madrid. I've never heard a crowd roar so much throughout an entire week. And in the final, just because sometimes it's hard to back up huge wins. He just beat Nadal and Djokovic back to back, then goes and defeats a third top 5 player in a row. He's the youngest player to ever do something like that, to defeat 3 top 5 players like that in one tournament.
In the women's singles in Madrid, Jabeur became the first African player to win a WTA Masters 1000 event, coming back to beat Jessica Pegula in the final. She's been talking to Denith Lloyd about her success.
I really received a lot of message from home or Tunisia. You know, people were going with the cars, celebrating, screaming, dancing, and it was a great feeling. And hopefully we can see more and more of that. It's just really inspiring for me as well to continue for the hard work and to continue.
Quarterfinals of a couple of Grand Slams now. You're in the top 10. You've won the Madrid Open. The next step on is obviously trying to win a major, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean it is one of my main goals, to be honest with you. It's really the Grand Slam that everybody follows, and people trying to kind of imitate, Serena Williams. I guess he kind of the generation before me, and just amazing to see how people
their best of 7 series at 2-2. Having Joel Embiid back in the team seems to have made all the difference. The 76ers went 2-0 down when he was out injured. He had another good game with 24 points. And James Harden caused Miami another very one-sided game in Chicago. They beat the Cubs 7-1 to complete a 3-game sweep. They were cruising to victory by the 9th inning when Trey Turner made sure of the win. It's a 6th straight victory for them. Chicago, by contrast, are having a terrible season so far. This was their 4th, won the World Series the way they celebrated here. They now have the 2nd best win percentage in the American League behind the New York Yankees. And finally, Anthony Rendon was being interviewed after the game when he narrowly avoided getting a soaking from his teammates instead.
One person can cause an effect. One person in HR can challenge outdated hiring practices. Champion you wish to see in the workplace today.
कभी परछाई बनके कभी विश्वास बनके दिल में साहस का एहसास देश के हर पल में रहते हैं
1956 से आज तक LIC हर पल आपके साथ.
It's just a few hundred meters away from where I'm standing now. You can hear the sound of shooting and explosions.
This is a storm that has now claimed at least 14 lives overnight. You had people rushing to their basements.
We break storms.
I'm not just on any construction site. I'm on one in a remote and barren part of the world, Shetland, where an internet connection is a luxury. Situated at the top of Scotland in the middle of the North Sea, the island. So here at Cairgor, the teams are building an electricity converter station and substation. It'll connect Shetland to the national grid and allow wind farms to export energy south. It's not just manpower, but new technology.
And then there's a fibre optic connection to each of the 5G masts. So what the 5G network does is provide a high-speed wireless internet connection, low latency and very high speed, essentially as fast as the incoming
fibre optic connection.
And with those 5
or maybe it's unsafe for us to go.
Spot has a scanner attached. It makes sure that the floor is exactly level after the engineers have poured the concrete.
We just performed a scan in there, and I'll show you the scan that we did there. Only a few reds, but that's a wee bit high. High is just 5 mil, yeah.
So what are you going to do with this data now?
Well, make reports and then hand it back to the engineers, and we'll work out a plan to try and solve these issues.
But Spot,
you can really get a feel of how this site is going to shape up in the future.
Exactly. Good for demonstration purposes then.
the augmented reality means anyone can see the progress of the site in real time and understand.
And the new tech that they get to work with is really excited about it. And from Spot the Dog to augmented reality, it's not hard to see why. It's all really cool stuff. But there is a serious side to it as well. It makes them work faster and more safe. And it means that less people need to come here to this site and deal with these ever-changing Shetland weather conditions. It's a win-win, really.
Hello, this is Impact. I'm Yalda Hakim. The Russian military troops in Red Square, the Russian leader alleged without evidence that Kiev had been planning military operations.
Preparations were openly underway for another punitive operation in Donbass and an invasion of our historic lands, including
Welcome back to the programme. President Putin alleging with no evidence that NATO had been exploring lands close to Russia and that Kiev might get nuclear weapons. He told soldiers they were fighting for what their predecessors had fought for during the Second World War. Western powers say Mr. Putin's invasion of Ukraine has brought...
Relaxed, smiling as he greeted veterans of conflicts past, even as he wages war in Ukraine. Victory Day is one of the most cherished holidays in the Russian calendar.
Preparations were openly underway for another punitive operation in Donbass and an invasion of our historic lands, including Crimea. Kyiv has announced a possible acquisition of nuclear weapons. NATO began...
But today was about rallying Russians too. Vladimir Putin has repeatedly tried to justify his war by telling them that Nazis in Ukraine threaten their country's peace, using Russia. The Kremlin admits that 1,300 soldiers have died in Ukraine. The real number is thought to be much higher. But grieving families are told their sons and husbands have died heroes, defending the motherland. Vladimir Putin. Jenny Hill, BBC News, Moscow.
Well, meanwhile, the fighting continues unabated in Ukraine after the failure of Russia's invasion around Kiev. The Kremlin diverted its forces to what it called the liberation of the Donbass.
Of Russian shrapnel. The 30-year-old builder volunteered to fight the day after Putin's invasion. His wife begged him not to go. Now his father is lost in grief. A lonely Ukrainian warplane thunders overhead. The front lines are just a town away to the north. And a defiant blitz spirit is growing here too, as the bombs fall at random in places like Kremlin's blundering army. But the blundering goes on. My shop is hardly a strategic target, says Lilia with contempt. And all this is stiffening the resolve. These frontline positions for weeks now, but the big picture here in the Donbass is that the Kremlin's offensive has largely stalled. They've taken hardly any significant towns, and the Ukrainians are making them pay a heavy price for every still inconsolable. But his widow brings their 5-year-old son to the graveside. He was a stubborn man and a good man, she tells us, sounding resolute now. As the
UK can helpfully add value to the Ukrainian effort, and we are going to continue our work with the Ukrainians over the future months to come. There's a huge amount of legal evidence, investigation of, unfortunately, conflict-related sexual violence. So there's a huge range of expertise that's required, and I'm honoured to be working hand in hand with the Iranian Prosecutor General, Irina Venedikova, and/or rape or other forms of violence at scale. And that's really a defining feature of war crimes. It's the scale of the atrocity. There's also, related to the crime of genocide, the them specifically and then mistreating them. But essentially, we are looking at murder and rape and other brutality to which the criminal law can readily apply.
And how challenging is that, though, to identify exactly become in the process?
It's always a challenge from an evidential and legal point of view, and robustness of evidence is vital to proving the case, as is the secure environment within which that...
Russia that's saying this is not a war, that this is not an invasion, and how do you deal with a leader like Putin who's not acknowledging any of the things that are taking place?
Well, I mean, it doesn't really... there are two strands to this. Contingent upon a legal process to adduce that evidence, bring those charges, and then prosecute those claims in the right manner. So it is all about collection of evidence. It's about testing.
Question about another issue. You said in March that dropping security checks on Ukrainian refugees could lead to a devastating terror attack. I mean, what did you mean by that, given the majority of people leaving that country are women and children?
Well, dropping checks would be, we do now know there have been some instances of some British people offering their homes on the Homes for Refugees scheme, and they haven't had the best intentions, and there is a risk of exploiting vulnerable women and children who falsely gain entry to the UK in a way that could be damaging to our security interests. So both interests are vital to protect, and that's why security checks are important.
Muskelatrofi, och det betyder att han är väldigt svag. Sen har vi byggt väldigt många spelkontroller just bara för att han ska kunna spela mer självständigt. Den var inte jättebra, men det blev ju bättre.
能够加入到游戏的这个行业里面来。
Så innan så kunde jag inte klicka R upp med R och L, fast nu har jag kunnat det.
Amid a severe economic crisis in the country. A curfew has been put in place throughout Sri Lanka after almost 80 people were injured in clashes between anti-government protesters and supporters of the Prime Minister and his brother, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa.
That's when the tensions began. Supporters of the Prime Minister, who's no longer the Prime Minister, of course, were seen attacking anti-government protesters quite violently in some cases, and we saw that with our own eyes, Yalda. We also spoke to some journalists down the road from here, Yalda, at Gallface Green, which is where, for weeks now, protesters have been peacefully demonstrating, some setting up tents and camping out there in protest at the government's handling of this ongoing financial crisis. Well, we saw those supporters.
Much of a surprise then that Mahinda Rajapaksa bowed down to this pressure, or was there murmurings that this was going to eventually happen?
That's a good question. Now, first of all, when we talk about the Rajapaksa minister, also accused of bringing Sri Lanka into its current financial mess. Now, Mahinda Rajapaksa, who has stepped down as Prime Minister, actually was president before in another term in office. And it wasn't really a surprise that he was going to step down.
The new rules are against Islamic teachings and violate women's rights. The UN also expressed concern, saying the new rules will affect relations between Afghanistan and the international community. We've been following this story closely for the past 9 months and investigating the erosion of women's...
...for their hair, and they see that as being perfectly in accordance with Islamic and Afghan values. So who are you to tell them how they should be dressing?
In Afghanistan, 99% of women follow the correct.
That's 99% of Afghan women are already wearing the hijab. Why have the new rules been introduced? That's a question I put to women's rights campaigner Mahbouba Siraj.
I mean, the man said it. 99% of the Afghan women, they have followed it, and they're still following it, and they will follow it. I don't even know where they got this 1%. I don't even see that 1%. Where are they? They're nowhere. And everybody actually in Afghanistan, 100. But what we do have we cover our heads, we cover our bodies, we wear long coats, we cover ourselves. So I don't understand it. This is becoming a game with these people, truly.
Teenage girls out of school, and to slowly erode the rights of women and girls in the country.
Yeah, that has been kind of the name of the game. But now the only thing is that even this game is kind of like a everyday pastime for these people.
That was Mahbouba Siraj, women's rights activist, speaking to me there from Kabul. Now, millions of voters in the Philippines have been to the polls to decide who will become the country's next president. Voting for Duterte is Mr. Marcos's only serious rival among 8 other candidates. Meanwhile, the outgoing president and his daughter, vice presidential frontrunner Sara Duterte, cast their votes in their hometown, Davao City. Well, our correspondent
rival has nearly 9 million votes, so he has double the lead on her at the moment. That's with more than half currently counted. So this isn't the official result, but it's an indication of where this is going. If this continues this way, it'll be a landslide for me to show all their good parts, removing all the extrajudicial killings, the tortures and the disappearances that happened during the martial law period, and instead presenting the big ticket infrastructure projects, the glorious and impaired. And people in that room have been waiting for more than 4 hours. We have heard of a story of one person who'd waited 13 hours from the beginning of the count to the end just to cast their vote. And this is leading to a lot of stress because people were being told to leave their ballot.
Who was looking for shells on an English beach found a tooth from one of the world's largest prehistoric sharks. Sammy Shelton was on holiday in Suffolk when he stumbled on the tooth. Megalodons are thought to have become extinct roughly 3
Hello there. There's a severe heatwave on the way to Pakistan in this week ahead, but at the same time, Pakistan sees rising temperatures day by day. At the point of landfall, and there will be some heavy rain. But further west, it's across Pakistan and to a degree northwest India, where we're going to see an extreme heatwave build, really, in the next few days. In Pakistan, by the time we get to Friday, we're looking at extending in from that cyclonic storm affecting Andhra Pradesh up towards the West Bengal region. I think we could get a 100 to 200 millimetres of rain from this system, so there will be some localised areas of flooding, and we will see some of that heavy rain extending into parts of Bangladesh later.
Food waste happens at every stage of the food supply chain, and the process of preventing it begins on the farm.
Whoa, Lorenzo, I found you.
Hi, James. drone that can move through cereals whilst measuring the temperature and moisture of the entire pile to identify critical hotspots.
Someone would eventually get a picture like this where they can just see a 3D.
While also nurturing the land and the farmers who grow on it, 2 words: sustainable agriculture. That means the soil stays healthy, the environment stays healthy, and the farms, you get it. So what does that look like? At Corteva Agriscience, it looks...
BBC experts check the facts behind the stories making the headlines. Go to the BBC News website and app to answer any questions you have about the big stories of the day. Reality Check. Get the facts straight.
Operations in areas of Ukraine that Russia has taken control of. He was addressing troops on Moscow's Red Square as part of a huge military parade for the anniversary of the defeat of Nazi Germany. Ukraine's president implied that Putin was repeating the crimes that have died in the protests, including an MP from the ruling party. And they're all your latest headlines here on BBC World News.
Now on.
We still have an unquenchable curiosity about the cosmos. But in practical terms, where is our fascination with space taking us? It's more than 5 decades since the first moon landing, and NASA is struck as NASA's chief scientist earlier this year. Are problems of money and geopolitics undermining NASA's mission?
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it is a real pleasure to have you on the show. And you have had a pretty remarkable 4 decades long career inside NASA. But if you were being honest with me, would you...
The program has not only humans that explore beyond Earth's boundaries, but also we have missions that study the universe or move out into the solar system and explore. And we've absolutely to be there. And I think that's what the attraction is. When humans step out on the moon or they float around in space station, that of course is going to garnish the public attention. But you know, our robotic missions, you know, ways.
If I asked you to sum up what NASA is for in a very brief mission statement, what would it be?
Exploring the universe and answering some of the top questions we want to know.
Into the space program. These days, NASA's lucky if it gets 0.4 or 5% of the federal government. Does that suggest to you that the politicians, and maybe the public too, have lost interest?
Do you want to use for NASA to explore space? And in fact, Congress has been very bipartisan in terms of its support of NASA, allowing us to continue on at a steady rate, making some
back to the moon as a prelude then to pushing on to a crewed expedition to Mars. They think that is something the public would like and is enthusiastic about, but they're not prepared to pay for it. You've had to already, before you left,
distancing and all the other problems that we've had. So there has been some effect to what we could get done during the pandemic, but we're making steady progress and we're really doing quite well. You know, we're building that.
With respect, you're not making
into the vehicle assembly building. We're working some issues. I mean, when we do something of the size that we've never done before, we have to move it methodically and carefully. But we're making really steady progress to doing that. I would agree with that. We won't be on the surface of Mars with humans in 2033. Now, you have to realize we're on the surface of Mars. We've been roving around on Mars. We've been doing all kinds of stuff on Mars, and that's absolutely...
Spent a lot of time talking and writing about your conviction that Mars can be, I think this is the right word, terraformed. You can adapt the atmosphere around Mars. You can use magnetic shields to place between Mars and the
phenomena of evaporation, transport, clouds forming, to really get into the climate of Mars. And as we do that, we also learn how to do a better job at that. And so consequently, the concepts that I do in terms of future thinking about how we can live and work on Mars are done in supercomputers, where we look at the physics and we look at what's happening. And many of those
driver of national security, of military interest, of Cold War geopolitics. That's why the investment was made. And if one looks to the future and where that kind of investment might be in space science, surely it's going to be supremacy. Isn't that where you and other Americans are probably going to have to focus your interest from a national security point of view?
Indeed, the U.S. has national. Well, my personal opinion is that NASA is not the only organization in the federal government that works in the space realm. Okay, and many different parts of the Department of Defense. So much spacecraft that sometimes die in orbit, causing what we would call orbital debris. That would be of danger to working satellites, that we need to track all those. We need to know where they are. We need to
the militarization of space and the notion that the United States needs to develop its capabilities there has led the US to ban all space cooperation with China. But it did not and has not banned space cooperation with Russia. Now, you've been one of NASA's leaders over the last decade or two or three on cooperation with Russia, particularly in the last decade, has been a major strategic mistake.
I think at this point, what we're seeing is that now we have our own servicing, our own ability.
Are in the middle of geopolitics, and your relationship with Russia, to many Americans, looks unacceptable.
Well, I think what you have to also realize is these astronauts, and I think that's important to do.
When NASA bosses told astronauts like Scott Kelly to tone down their criticism of Russia on social media, you were supportive of that, were you?
I was. NASA needs to.
And it's not just about state actors, is it? It's also about privateers. It's about the billionaires like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, who are determined to play a huge role in space exploration. And NASA,
15 years ago, we started that whole concept of doing more commercial activities. We funded them as startups. Of course, we want them to come in and be part of
mission into low orbit. What is being achieved scientifically? Nothing at all. You're just making space the domain of the super rich.
This conversation perhaps is much. So you have to recognize what's happening is the start of, I think, commercializing access to space in a way that will provide a new dimension in the way we travel, the way we think. It does, but it's always been that way. What you haven't recognized is every time we put out a request for proposal, obtain those, make a selection, many times we'll have protests, many times we'll have to go to court and petition. It's about getting the best value for our dollar, and that's the method that we've developed to do that.
Before we end, I don't want this to be a depressing end to our interview, but I do want to consider some of the extreme threats to our beautiful blue planet. Electronic infrastructure.
Yes, indeed. We're recognizing that we haven't seen the most intense sun in the space age that we could have. We've been blown off, hitting the Earth in such a way that causes huge auroras. And the auroras go through Canada, through the United States, through Mexico, through Central America. And if you were in Colombia, processes now such that many companies are taking the alert system that the U.S. is producing. The NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, is responsible for space weather alerts. And so we do that.
Scientist job at NASA before it was confirmed that there is indeed any form of life beyond our own planet. Now, I don't want to be miserable about you and your fate, but do you believe confirmation of
on it? And we also didn't recognize that there are planets around other stars. We didn't think we could even measure them and see them. Now we know there are more planets in our galaxy than there are stars. And many are more Venus-like, are they more Mars-like, are they more Earth-like? This is a huge step forward. So I think we're going to see some really astounding discoveries in the next handful of years.
Jim Green, I feel like our conversation is only really just starting.
से आज तक LIC हर पल आपके साथ।
Nature, all-powerful and uncompromising, a force over which mankind has no control.
Since 1933, बरसों से सरसों.
Hello there, let's take a look at the weather pattern across the United States. We've got a band of rain extending in across the northern plains on this weather front you can see here on the charts. Now this rain is good. It sees temperatures well above average, 35 degrees as well in Dallas, but generally cool weather extending in across the western side of the United States with rain and some mountain snow as well. Now we've got heavy showers and thunderstorms again in the forecast for northern areas of Brazil, get around 25 to 50. Got a trough that's been bringing some rain across southern parts of Mozambique. That moves into the south of Madagascar through Tuesday, so you'll get some thundery showers here. A few sandstorms for the southwest of Saudi Arabia and across the United Arab Emirates with some fairly brisk winds, gusting rainfall on the way to Queensland. We are likely to see some flooding issues building up here. By the time we get to Thursday, some places could see over half a metre of rain. As I say, it is extreme rainfall we're expecting. I would expect some severe flooding.
Active military development of the territories adjacent to ours. This was an absolutely unacceptable threat, systematically created for us and right on our borders.
On the ground in Ukraine, the struggle for the Donbass region shows the slow pace. As violence grips the Sri Lankan capital, the Prime Minister resigns. Will that be enough to end the protests? And could this man, the son of Ferdinand Marcos, become the next president of the Philippines? It's his supporters defending him, insisting all rules were followed when he shared a curry and beer with campaign workers in an MP's office last April. Suggestions in Westminster that Sir Keir might offer to resign if he is found months for breaking the law, and Sir Keir, of course, repeatedly calling for Boris Johnson's resignation as a result of that. So we wait to hear from Sir Keir Starmer, and as soon as he speaks, we'll obviously bring that to you and bring you major announcements related to the war or list any sort of victories. Ukraine's president says Moscow is reenacting the crimes of the Nazis. Well, let's head to Dnipro and let's head to our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucet. Lise.
Use it as a moment to announce an intensification of the war or even an end to his special military operations. Security was strengthened across this country, with some towns and cities even under curfew in anticipation.
He greeted veterans of conflicts past, even as he wages war in Ukraine. Victory Day is one of the most cherished holidays in the Russian calendar. It's sombre, but But it's a celebration too, of victory over Nazi Germany, and the eyes of the world were on Red Square. Vladimir Putin, unable. Fewer troops, less military hardware than usual on display, resources presumably tied up in Ukraine. This was, as always, a display of might intended for the outside world. A less than subtle hint at Russia's nuclear arsenal. Have died heroes defending the motherland. Vladimir Putin's war has not gone well. But even as Russia reflects on the cost of conflict, he seems determined to fight on. Jenny Hill, BBC News.
President Putin again accused Ukraine of having Nazis here and Nazi policies. President Zelensky, however, turned it around, saying it was the actions of Russia which were like those of Nazi Germany in the bombardment.
24th, we realised this truth when a fake friend started a war against Ukraine. This is not a war of two armies, this is a war of two worldviews. The war waged by barbarians who shelled the Skövledar Museum and believe that scares them. In essence, we're free people who have their own path. Today, we're waging war on this path, and we'll not give anyone a single piece of our land. Today, we celebrate the day of victory over Nazism.
Two provinces that it regards as, like the rest of Ukraine, as part of Russia. That after having failed to secure that swift and victory across much of the rest of Ukraine, including the capital, Kiev.
Now his father is lost in grief. But something else is stirring in this village and across this region. A burning sense of defiance. He was defending freedom for Lilia with contempt. And all this is stiffening the resolve of Ukrainian soldiers. We met this tank unit, holding their ground at a spot where Russia has been trying to break through. They badly need better. Hardly any significant towns, and the Ukrainians are making them pay a heavy price for every scrap of land. Further out in no man's land, Ukrainian volunteers collect the abandoned bodies of. But his widow brings their 5-year-old son to the graveside. He was a stubborn man and a good man, she tells us, sounding resolute now, as the struggle for the Donbass grinds on. Andrew Harding, BBC News.
Information that we've heard in the past, namely that Ukraine was somehow preparing some sort of invasion when in fact it was Russia that invaded Ukraine without any provocation or justification whatsoever, or that Ukraine was bent on getting nuclear weapons. Well, there's frankly a lot of concerns. Russia has regrouped, refitted, and prepared for a intensified conflict in the Donbass in southern and eastern Ukraine. That includes what's happened already in Donetsk and Luhansk, or to create a sort of a fabricated justification for these regions' incorporations into Russia. But also just the scale of the civilian toll.
Let me just pick up. Yes, of course, there is great concern about these reports of atrocities and abuses, but also concern, too, as you mentioned, about the effort to impose political changes in places like Melitopol and Kherson have been very, very restive populations.
Well, there's a number of things that Russia's doing. They have taken over the local municipal councils and in a lot of cases, the elected, and then many others disappear, and we frankly don't know what is happening, but we have seen reports that at least some have been killed. And so this is extremely alarming. Russia's also forced the local population to use the Russian ruble. They've changed place.
Ambassador Carpenter, thank you very much for joining us with your assessment from the OSCE in Vienna. Well, let's cross now to Tbilisi in Georgia for another perspective on the speech by President Putin today. We can
As no general mobilization was announced today. Now I am getting nervous. It could be announced
tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, and so on. But according to all his so-called history,
many Russians rely on the state television network, believe what it has to say. President Putin, according to opinion polls, remains popular. Many would be expressing support for what he had to say today.
Honestly support Putin in his deeds and in his decisions. I don't know. I know that that the official statistics is quite horrifying, and I'm terribly shocked, and we don't know what's going on. And of course, for scientists, for political analytics, for political scientists, for sociologists, for me as a journalist, as a person, as a human, official numbers, and they are nothing actually.
And Anamsa, thank you very much for joining us. And as you emphasize, yes, these are really crucial tools to help us try to understand.
Breach of COVID-19 rules, stressing, though, he had followed the law at all times, going on to say, I don't believe those accusing me believe it themselves. I think they're trying to make the public believe that all politicians are the same. He was speaking in the last few minutes.
In politics, undermine our democracy and undermine Britain. I'm absolutely clear that no laws were broken. They were followed at all times. And step down. This matters. It matters because the British public deserve politicians who think the rules apply to them. They deserve politicians who hold themselves and who put the country first rather than themselves. They will always, always get that from me.
Well, let's speak to the BBC's UK political correspondent, Rob Watson. Rob, you were listening to, and I suppose politically, it also highlights the difference in position between the leader of the opposition and the current Prime Minister.
That is certainly what the Leader of the Opposition will be wanting, to draw some kind of on the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. But my goodness, what a gamble, what an extraordinary moment, Matthew.
And Rob, is there any sort of indication of when Durham police are going to make their judgment? Earlier in the day, police announced an overnight curfew following violent clashes between pro and anti-government supporters. Reports say an MP from the governing party was killed after he opened fire on protesters blocking his car outside.
Public demanding that President Gotabaya Rajapaksa should resign, along with his elder brother Mahinda Rajapaksa, and along with his entire family from the cabinet. And however, with protests going for over a month, we did not see. It's a very worrying situation right now.
It is a worrying situation. In terms of what you were outlining there, do you think the protests will stop now the Prime Minister has gone, or will they continue to try to get his brother, the President, to also go?
Of the Prime Minister and several former ministers, current MPs who are in support of Mahinda Rajapaksa was seen making very strong statements inciting violence. They were basically instigating violence against the peaceful protesters, and we see their houses being set on fire. We see their offices being set on fire, and we've unfortunately lost a member of parliament today. We still don't know how he was killed. There are rumors that he committed suicide. There are rumors that he killed himself.
What is the way out of this?
Well, we currently don't have a finance minister in the country. When the Prime Minister resigns, the entire cabinet goes away with him. That's how the constitution works. So right now, we don't even have a finance minister who could even continue the negotiation. And with the executive presidency, where the president is far more superior and powerful than the legislature or the parliament, we are going to see a far more bad situation in the country, because we've just been told that there will be no gas for 3 months, diesel for the next 2 weeks, because one of our coal power plant has broken down. Therefore, all the diesel that's currently available in the country will be used to power generators. Otherwise, we'd be in the dark for 13, 14 hours like we were into 2 months. All these for this economic crisis and for the crisis that is happening right now, where unfortunately we don't know by tomorrow how many lives we are going to lose, how much of damage we're going to cause to public property, because the country has just gone out of control.
Well, as you say, the news with Matthew Amroliwala. On today's global programme, Russia uses its annual Victory Day parade to justify its war in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin tries to tie the war in Ukraine to the fight against Nazis. We'll get analysis from our World Affairs editor, John Simpson, here in a moment or two. Also on today's programme. We'll be back live in Sri Lanka, in the capital, as the Prime Minister resigns amid violence. The operation was necessary and had been provoked by the West. But he didn't make any major announcement related to the war or suggest when or how it might end. The Victory Day parade featured thousands of troops, tanks and nuclear missiles.
The intrude on our historic land. In Kiev they were saying that they might get nuclear weapons, and NATO started exploring the lands.
What we heard today from Vladimir Putin.
Well, like so many of these kind of things, I think it was what wasn't said and what didn't happen that was more important than actually what was said. There was a fairly no hint of any kind of nuclear threat. I do think that's really important. I think if he were planning to do something like that, this was the moment when he would have said, if you, among the planes taking part, supposedly, and people have seen it in the practice runs, was the plane that President Putin and his top advisors, top people, would
than we expected. There was no call, for example, to mobilise reservists. Do you think that limits Vladimir Putin's ability to prosecute a long war?
Well, it might do, but there are big problems about it. It refused to turn up and so forth, and it would cause the kind of disturbances, or it could do at any rate, that President Putin really wants to avoid. So, yes, I mean, all these things he could still make new, and I think the depressing conclusion is that it'll just sink down into a long drawn-out battle in the east of the country, a battle which, and Paris, other capitals, that President Putin didn't ratchet the whole thing up. I think that's an important element in it. Now I think it'll simply be a question of fighting a war. We know that a lot of the Russian troops in particular are prepared to use any methods whatsoever, and the Ukrainians are so bitter about what's happened to them that, there must be a question about their tactics again.
We know so much about Mariupol. Interesting that Ukraine said a little earlier that they want the UN Human Rights Council to hold a special session on Ukraine in Geneva, surrounding, of course, human rights and all that.
And after warning last week, a warning from the Finance Ministry that its foreign currency reserves were dangerously low at just $50 million today, we've learned that China's Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is considering a $100 million money be if it indeed is drawn down.
It will be very, very useful for Sri Lanka because, like you pointed out, usable foreign reserves are as low as $50 million and the country gets cooking gas. So any money coming in right now as emergency fund is very required. But will it really come is the question, with the kind of political uncertainty now with the resignation of the Prime Minister and the cabinet getting dissolved. That's a question that Sri Lanka needs. With credit lines or even talking on restructuring of their loan. They have also very categorically and openly shown their displeasure that Sri Lanka approached IMF for a bailout package. And hence, any money, any assistance coming from with no cabinet, no finance ministry and any team that they had spoken to a couple of hours ago, who is leading those talks and how the negotiations would go forward is again something very uncertain right now.
And from the Development Bank's perspective, is this loan contingent on there being a stable government in place?
Absolutely. Whether it is the International Monetary Fund that is talking on a complete bailout package, whether it is the other lenders who are talking about restructuring, all of the plans to bring an economic stability goes out of question if there is no political stability in the country. And hence, what is happening around us right now in Sri Lanka on the political side with violence, and there is something happening right behind me in the official
below $33,000 earlier today, that for the first time since July of last year. Now, Bitcoin has lost 50% of its value since it reached its peak in November of last year. Ethereum, which is the second biggest cryptocurrency, much more mainstream.
Something has changed, and it's really the big investors, the hedge funds, the fund managers. You may remember for years and years that Bitcoin supporters used to look forward to the day that the big institutions would come into the market and start investing. Necessarily see Bitcoin as a special safe haven money. They saw it more as the opposite, more as a risk asset, similar to tech stocks. And so when the economy started looking dodgy, inflation up, interest rates rising, and they were de-risking their portfolios, in other words,
Stream investing in it now, could those die-hard fans, start to see it differently? It becomes a bit normalized almost.
I think the diehard fans will always be diehard fans. At least that's the impression that I get on Twitter. Certainly during market downturn just now, you referred to the possibility of an about turn in interest rates. Maybe the Federal Reserve will suddenly realize the economy is going down and that they'd better start reducing interest rates. Now, if they decide to do that, that is the hope, not just for Bitcoin, but also for stocks, I would suspect.
Glenn Goodman there. Just time for one other piece of business news, and the British budget airline EasyJet has a new plan to deal with staff shortages. It is removing 6 seats from some of its planes so it can operate flights with fewer cabin crew. Airlines are required to have 1 member of crew for every 50 seats. By taking out the back row of its A319 fleet, EasyJet reduces its capacity to 150 passengers so they can run their flights with 3 flight attendants instead of 4. The Philippines.
Nature, all-powerful and uncompromising, a force over which mankind has no control. But when one aligns
देश के हर पल कभी परछाई बनके कभी विश्वास बनके दिल में साहस का एहसास बनके उम्मीदों को सच्चाई के रंग से सजाते हैं मुश्किलें
has resigned. Now let's turn to the Philippines, because millions of voters in the Philippines have been to the polls to decide who will become the country's next president. Local media is reporting that Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Bongbong, the popular candidate, is the song of a former dictator. The outgoing Vice President Leni Robredo, a vocal critic of the retiring President Rodrigo Duterte, is Mr. Marcos's only serious rival among 8 other candidates.
Nearly 2,000 machines broken, and that has really caused a lot of stress and anger. And we went along to a polling station in Makati and saw that 3 of the machines had been broken. 1 was still not working by the time we got of the count to the end just to cast their vote. And this is leading to a lot of stress because people were being told to leave their ballot papers behind and just trust officials that they would be pushed through. Normally you're supposed to receive a ticket where you can leave and say, I know who I'm voting.
Missile strikes are a constant reminder that the war is never far away. Our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucet, has sent this from Dnipro.
In the heat of battle, ironclad commitment on the home front. There's a big aid effort too. Dnipro is a first stop for families fleeing Russia's growing onslaught to the east. On this street alone, a queue for cash handouts and hygiene kits. This bridge and a railway facility. Shattering weeks of quiet here. Several hours' drive from the main front lines. At moments you might even forget there's a war. Not for long.
Everything is whizzing by and you're in the basement. We didn't want to leave. We had to do it because of my daughter. I left my town to protect my daughter's life.
The train arrives from the east. Vladimir rushes in on leave from the front line, searching for Gennady. A grievous war many thought could never happen. Now no one knows when and how it can ever end. Lise Doucette, BBC News, Dnipro.
से आज तक LIC हर पल आपके साथ. P-marked mustard oil has always followed in nature's footsteps, extracting mustard oil using completely natural methods, focusing only on purity and quality, and leaving the rest to nature. Because when we live in harmony with nature, life can be great.
Arts and Culture on BBC World News.
Filipinos have voted for their next president. Opinion polls put Bongbong Marcos, son of the late dictator Ferdinand Marcos, well in the lead. But can his chief opponent, Leni Robredo,
Being at the heart of a live news show is challenging. So when events move quickly, you need to make
to Russia.
NATO began active military development of the territories adjacent to ours. This was an absolutely unacceptable threat, systematically created for us and right on our borders.
In central eastern Ukraine, on a day when Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky marks Victory Day by comparing Russia's actions to that of Nazi Germany.
Also on today's programme, the leader of Britain's made
do the right thing and step down.
And as violence grips the Sri Lankan capital, the Prime Minister resigns. Will that be enough to end the protests? National correspondent Lise Doucette, who's in Dnipro.
Yes, you joined us in central eastern Ukraine. We're several hours' drive from the main front lines in Donbass in eastern Ukraine, where the bulk of Russia's fighting forces and his special military operation, a war. Even some saying that he could announce a victory and bring this war to an end. But none of that came from Moscow, a day of pomp and ceremony. Let's get more details.
27 million Soviets died in the Second World War. But it's a celebration too, a victory over Nazi Germany, and the eyes of the world were on Red Square.
Preparations were openly underway for another punitive operation in Donbass and an invasion of our historic lands, including Crimea. Kyiv has announced a possible acquisition of nuclear weapons. NATO began active...
He tried to justify his war by telling them that Nazis in Ukraine threaten their country's peace, using Russia's painful past to legitimise his present. And there was a rare acknowledgement of the price paid.
narratives about Nazism and fascism today from Moscow, as we just heard. President Putin again condemning the Nazis as he sees it here in Ukraine. President Zelensky, though, in his speech today, marking Victory Day, deporting hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians. He accused President Putin of not learning the lessons of the victors in the Second World War.
There is nothing more dangerous than when a fake friend started a war against Ukraine. This is not a war of two armies, this is a war of two worldviews. The war waged by barbarians who shelled the Skopje Museum and believe that their missiles can destroy our philosophy, our history.
Well, today in Moscow, the Russian leader again repeated that his special military operation here in Ukraine was going according to plan. And yet, with every day, it is clear that the swift and
farewell to Ivan Naduty, killed by a scrap of Russian shrapnel. The 30-year-old builder volunteered to fight the day after Putin's invasion. His wife begged him not to go. A lonely Ukrainian warplane thunders overhead. The front lines are just a town away to the north. And a defiant blitz spirit is growing here too, as the bombs fall at random in places. Ukrainian soldiers. We met this tank unit, holding their ground at a spot where Russia has been trying to break through. They badly need better equipment, but they have other strengths.
We are unity. We fight for.
Ukrainian volunteers collect the abandoned bodies of Russian soldiers. Too many to count, according to Alexei Yukov. I can't see how the Russian army can keep going. It's losing. But his widow brings their 5-year-old son to the graveside. He was a stubborn man and a good man, she tells us, sounding resolute now, as the struggle for the Donbass grinds on.
This war, it's still possible that that could be declared in the days and the weeks ahead. And with no talk of any ceasefires or peace talks in any capital right now, all that Ukrainians have come to expect is a war that will go with our correspondents across this region. But for now, I'll hand you back to the studio in London.
Lise, thanks once again. Lise Doucette there for us in Dnipro. Now to other news, and Sri Lanka's Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa has resigned. He was killed after he opened fire on protesters blocking his car outside of the capital. Well, our correspondent Rajini Vaidyanathan has been following the developments from Colombo.
Well, it's been a tense day here in the Sri Lankan capital, Colombo. It began beaten up. One journalist we spoke to also said he was told by the police to delete all the footage on his camera. You can see very lively scene here. Protester Rajapaksa did quit. He said in his statement that he quit after a lot of pressure, of course, but he said that the reasons for Sri Lanka's financial crisis were due to the ongoing war and the government with the opposition to take Sri Lanka through this economic crisis. The country is now starting talks with the IMF. But this isn't going to be an overnight fix for a country that is in deep economic trouble.
Well, that was the latest.
Using completely natural methods, focusing only on purity and quality, and leaving the rest to nature. Because when we live in harmony with nature, life can be great.
The mustard specialist since 1933. Barso se sarso.
Welcome back to Global here on BBC World News. Now it's a milestone they expect to pass in the next few hours. A bells will be rung at Washington's National Cathedral this evening, once for every 1,000 Americans who've died from COVID-19. You'll remember this. This is the global map from Johns Hopkins University, which we saw so much of in the early part of this 250,000 deaths worldwide. Well, Bill Hannage is an Associate Professor of Epidemiology and Co-Director of the Centre for Communicable Disease Dynamics at Harvard. Thank you so much for being here on BBC News to speak to us. How do you view
And we still see huge disparities in the country in terms of people who are dying even now.
There's been such a politicization of COVID in the US and some other countries, but what does the evidence say in terms
and its experience during the Delta wave? It had numbers of people dying that were similar to folks who were being caught in the very first wave. And this is at a point when vaccines are available. The reasons for that dreadful toll are that people who are vulnerable have not been vaccinated. You do have to accept that the threat is real and that there are things that you can do about it. We have the tools, we just have to use them.
In terms of vaccines, right from day one, and Joe Biden, he made it absolutely central. How successful was he in changing the dynamic?
He's had some limited success, but I don't think we can blame the president for issues which often rest with the states, because part of the nature of the country is that a lot of decisions are made at the state level rather than the federal level. Lots of people have criticized the message on booster doses, which have been so important for the Omicron wave. Now we're talking about fourth doses. A lot of people are confused about who needs to get them.
And in terms of vaccines and the cover they give people, I mean, what is the latest from that? Is there a clear picture yet?
It's pretty clear that if you have had 3 shots, you are protected against infection for some period of time, but it's not terribly long. It's a couple of months, perhaps. After that, you can be infected by who are under-vaccinated. 2 shots are a lot better than none, and are a lot better than 1. But really, if you're in a vulnerable age group, you should want to have 3 shots, or possibly 4. Go and talk to your doctor.
Just a final question in terms of where America is.
Done very much here so far. I think that's possibly because more people got infected by the variant that was circulating previously. The United States is pretty COVID curious right now. And as a result of that, there's a decent amount of immunity. But if you want to know what's going to happen next,
has said he will resign if he's found to have broken COVID lockdown laws. Police are investigating whether he broke the rules last year. Sir Keir insists no rules were broken. The opposition leader has repeatedly, though, called for Boris Johnson to resign for breaking the law.
Undermine that principle, undermine trust in politics, undermine our democracy, and undermine Britain. I'm absolutely clear that no laws were broken. They were.
Goodness, what a risk, what a gamble. But one wonders really, Matthew, whether Keir Starmer really had much choice. Regular viewers will know that he has really made quite a strong case of criticising
Prime Minister Boris Johnson. But in terms of the event being investigated here by Durham Police, just explain a little more of the background to this.
I'll try to. It's during what's known as a by-election. It was in, I think it was in April of 20. When it was over, he went to an MP from that area and they had some drinks and they had some food. They ordered a takeaway curry. Now, the question is, was that sort of okay? You were allowed to have work gatherings if they were absolutely essential. Is it okay?
We have the number of allegations against the Prime Minister, with the Metropolitan Police still investigating. Remind us where we are with all of that.
Right, absolutely. And Labour is drawing the distinction, saying that, look, this was rooms. And the point they would make is that there are something like 12, I think it is, Matthew, gatherings, alleged gatherings at Downing Street that broke the violations. And these include allegedly things like farewell parties, which, you know, one might say were not part of work. Anyway, where we are, he will get more fines, as indeed will some of his staff.
Rob Watson, on the latest developments there in Westminster, a really interesting last couple of hours it's been, and I'm sure there's going to be more reaction in the coming hours.
Cyclonic storm Asani out in the Bay of Bengal, and actually the convection, the thundercloud is actually displaced a bit to the west of this system. All that means is the rain is running ahead of this system. It will tend to weaken before it makes landfall during Tuesday in the next few days. In Pakistan, by the time we get to Friday, we're looking at the highest temperatures reaching 51 degrees Celsius. So extremely hot weather, not far off the national record, which I believe is 53.5.
बनके उम्मीदों को सच्चाई के रंग से सजाते हैं मुश्किलें कोई हरदम साथ निभाते हैं कल आज और कल में
LIC हर पल आपके साथ.
I want to talk to you about the politics of this. Did she not think she was going to get that question? Feeding you the stories. Maybe this is the context.
News in depth. The Context with Christian Fraser on BBC World News.
Another Chinese container ship has just arrived here in Athens. China now owns most of this.
Filipinos have voted for their next president. Opinion polls put Bongbong Marcos, son of the late dictator Ferdinand Marcos, well in the lead. But can his chief opponent, Leni Robredo, use her pink power progressive revolution to cause...
This is BBC World News. Our main headlines here. Vladimir Putin has described the invasion of Ukraine as a preemptive strike. He alleged, without evidence, in the protests, including an MP from the ruling party.
Global business news from the boardroom or grass.
For the rebuilding when the shooting finally stops. Just keeping the country going through the ravages of war is costing billions of dollars it doesn't have. Ukraine's finance minister tells me how bad the damage is and what it means for his country's future. Also, how can the rest of the world help Ukraine get back up on its feet? I'm here in London at the headquarters of the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, which was set up to help rebuild Central and Eastern Europe after the fall of communism in Russia. I'm going to catch up with its president to find out how they can help. Wherever in the world you're joining me from, once again, a big hello and a very warm welcome to the show. The war in Ukraine, it's now well into its third month. It's a conflict that is causing huge suffering for millions, and even if it was hit by the coronavirus pandemic. It was worth about $180 billion and expected to grow a healthy 3.6% this year. But the fighting means it's now forecast to shrink 45%, which means its economy is losing even more cash. And all of this begs the question of just how President Zelensky's government can keep the economy going and how will it fund the widespread rebuilding when the fighting does eventually stop. Let's pick up on that idea that Ukraine needs billions of dollars of financial support each month just to keep going. How has the economy adapted to the unprecedented challenges of war? Shops and factories, they've had to close, and that all-important farming industry
is working in very different conditions, I mean, in comparison with pre-war time. So now our revenues can cover slightly half of our expenditure, except of military and service and debt. The government try to do what we need to do to support internally displaced people which need the most government support.
Sergei, last year, your tax revenues, which of course is a big share of the money you're able
for war damages, because more than 20% of our businesses are fully closed. It means that we can manage to fulfill our necessary duty as government to have balanced budget.
Before the war, Sergei, some of your biggest earners for the country were all the crop production. I mean, such as sunflower and corn and wheat, as well as iron ore. Are you still able to export any?
So, if you see that right now the situation a little bit changed because of our food commodities are fully blocked in our harbors in Odessa region. Infrastructure, specifically western border infrastructure, are more able to receive necessary amount of export-oriented goods towards west of Ukraine.
And Sergei, last month, your president...
Through paying pension salaries for healthcare workers, for people who works in the educational sphere, etc. It's only very critical needs, except of help Russia to receive additional amount to make their budget run with surplus. In comparison with us, we're running with very huge deficit. Russia's budget is very crucial questions should be delivered, as well as with other international sanctions on imports, some additional duties or caps. It's also welcome from Ukraine. So we have a full embargo on all goods from Russia, but our transit service is related to Eastern European countries mostly. That's
just make the decision by itself and close those pipelines?
You know, it's impossible. It's impossible because of some natural reasons. Because if you have somebody from one hand to receive, open this tube and to make this gas flowing in other directions.
Sergei, to rebuild Ukraine, do you envisage the need for some sort of Marshall Plan? You know, of course, that was the US plan to help.
Damages which we received from them.
Some suggest that Russian assets that have been frozen around the world should be used to pay for the reconstruction in Ukraine.
Yes, it could be Russia frozen assets which can be seized and used to support Ukraine. And I know that Canada and the United States are moving in that direction. They prepare some draft of.
But Sergei, if that money was to be used to rebuild the country, doesn't that mean that the international community can't use that tool to unfreeze those assets? Coming up after the break, I speak to the head of one of Europe's leading development bodies about
a force over which mankind has no control. But when one aligns with nature, she is warm, nurturing and loving. B-Mark mustard oil has always followed in nature's footsteps, extracting mustard oil using completely natural methods
to protect the future of our food. Join me, James Wong, for Follow the Food on BBC World News.
Day. The destruction ranges from roads and bridges to factories and apartment blocks. And the cost of rebuilding all of that when the fighting's over will be enormous. And Ukraine simply can't afford it all by itself. But can you explain what the EBRD does?
So the EBRD is a multilateral development bank with government as a shareholders. We have more than 70 countries being shareholders of the bank.
And this makes you one of the right organizations, if you will, to help rebuild Ukraine then?
Yes, because Ukraine has been one of our first countries of operation. We've invested a lot in Ukraine in the last 30 years. We are
coming?
I think, first of all, we don't know exactly what are the amounts for the reconstruction that will be needed because we are still in the war. So it's very difficult to assess. We know now some key infrastructure, a lot of buildings, some cities have been completely destroyed. I think the Ukrainian government Marshall Plan type for Ukraine, a bit like what has been done following World War II in Europe to rebuild the country. You know, the country before the war was engaged in a big reform agenda to improve. Will need to be implemented in Ukraine post-war.
Countries have been running up massive debts over the past 2 years just dealing with the pandemic. It's going to be tricky, isn't it? When
the military support, but also support to the government. The US have just announced a very important package. It shows that there is a real solidarity and that Western countries from US, Canada, the EU, Europe by the war, either through energy prices, gas prices, energy security, food prices, or the need, for example, for countries in Central Asia, the need to completely reorganize their economic infrastructure. You can see the logic of
using some of these
assets. I think when you have the history of Europe in mind, the notion of reparation calls for sort of alert. I think we need to be aware of that also, because it had a very, strong impact on Germany, and was one of the origin of what came with Hitler and Nazism and so forth. So I think that for Europeans, this is a part of the memory, the level of destruction and so forth, but 7 years. It's very difficult to engage into reconstruction and new investment in a country where you don't know how long this will stay, and whether there is a risk of destruction very quickly. And for institutions...
That's almost come to a standstill. Is there much that the bank can do to help that all-important sector get back up and running?
So you're right. First of all, this is a key issue, and the swing campaign, buying fertilizers, buying oil to get the system functioning. However, one big hurdle, and on which it's very difficult to find the appropriate response, is logistics, because of the situation in the port. And so if you take the train, it's much, the capacity, I understand using the railway system, it would take 3 years to get one year of wheat out of the country, rather than using the boat, because it's much more...
In a recent episode of the show, we broadcast an interview that mentioned Koch Industries as one of a number of companies still operating in Russia. Well, since that interview was recorded, Koch Industries have issued an update saying that they're working on a strategy with their subsidiary company,
One person can cause an effect. One person in HR can challenge outdated hiring practices, champion modern benefits, advocate for pay equity, and turn
वही स्वाद नया अंदाज अमूल चीज ये मेरा
completely natural methods, focusing only on purity and quality and leaving the rest to nature. Because when we live in harmony with nature, life can be great.
The mustard specialist since 1933. बरसों से सरसों.
कल्लाज और कल में रहते हैं, देश के हर पल में रहते हैं.
1956 से आज तक LIC हर पल आपके साथ.
As much, and it's been the way that my whole career has been.
I bring that part of my Asian culture with me into everything I do.
Yeah, they can destroy us, but we'll answer. They can kill us.
We might be able to stop or even reverse the aging process.